the next thing I wanted to talk about deals directly with COVID-19, and many have heard this term Black Swan event, and I wanted to go over um, what is a Black Swan event? What does that mean? How does it function? What does it mean from a systems thinking standpoint? And how does that relate to COVID? So um, what is a Black Swan? So a Black Swan event has three criteria. It's usually a surprise event to the observer. That doesn't mean that it's a surprise to anyone, but it's a surprise event to the observer. It has a major impact or effect, and it's often rationalized in hindsight as predictable. But the nature of Black Swan events is that they are almost by definition statistically unlikely or improbable, and yet they have this major effect. And then afterwards, in hindsight, we sort of said, well, we should have seen that coming. So COVID-19 is an excellent example of a Black Swan event. Another was the financial collapse of 2009. Certainly, people before 2009 were saying there's a problem in the housing market. I said there was one going back to 2004. Certainly, people have warned about pandemics and the potential for a global pandemic. But for most business leaders, this came as a surprise. COVID-19 was not something they started their calendar. You know, when they sat down to do strategic planning for 2020, they didn't say, oh yeah, we're gonna have a global pandemic that collapses the stock markets, shuts down all global travel. More than half the country is gonna be in lockdown conditions. And yeah, that's fine. And by the way, we need to improve improve our safety. They just weren't planning that kind of strategy. So for businesses, COVID-19 for most was a surprise event. It certainly has had a major impact, and it's had this rationalizing hindsight. In fact, in some ways, COVID has been like a black swan cannonballing into your pond. So if you think about your local business area, your environment as being like a pond, COVID-19 came like a black swan cannonballing into the pond and sends ripples of turbulence out. Part of this episode is talking about turbulence and understanding it. When a black swan hits, because it has a major effect, it's going to create these ripple effects. And the way you feel these ripple effects depends on your proximity to where the black swan lands. We can think about this as when COVID-19 first hit, it hit hardest in airlines and travel industries, events, anything that was people to people related at mass size. It hit that area almost immediately. I remember in March, we were dealing with some clients that were in conference planning and event planning, and they got absolutely hammered by this. And it rapidly, as those ripples spread out, your consequences were, you weren't immune to it. If you were, when the cities began shutting down and states began closing down and people began withdrawing from consumers, that ripple effect was further out in the pond, but it would be restaurants, bars, entertainment venues. Those certainly got hit. And even further out are the businesses that were sort of, might be white collar or blue collar, but not front facing with the public, where yes, they could still operate, but they were either losing business because they didn't have the work coming in from construction or things like that, or they had to remove their workers from an office environment and shift them to a work from home environment. So your location in the pond, right, relative to where the cannonball of Black Swan event arrives, determines how large an impact. You can think of this wave somewhat like a tsunami. The closer you are, the bigger this wave is going to be and the more impact it's going to have on your business. The problem is that, as we talked about in turbulence, these waves come from multiple directions. And so these Black Swan events often amplify themselves based off the reactions we have. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But when it comes to, a big question we deal with right now that clients is like, how do I survive this? And we've been working on that for the last few months, but they're like, how do I not have this not happen again, right? What's the right business model for a Black Swan event? And this gets into the system structure of understanding. Think of your business model. If you're in that pond, right, your business model is a structure that comes up from the pond floor, right? It sits on the floor of the pond and it may go up above the water. If that wave hits your structure and blows it apart, you're going bankrupt. Your business will go under, you're doing it. So you can think of the business model as this structure that's got to absorb this wave coming. And the closer you are to that cannonball, the bigger and more forceful the wave is going to be. And therefore, the more important your business model. The further you are out from it, you may not need to change your business model structure, but in something this large and this massive with this many ripple effects, it's hard to believe that not every business structure is being challenged in one way or another. So what are some of the business model options that you can think about when dealing with Black Swan events? Well, there's 4 general ones you hear about, and I'll go through each one in order. But from a high level, you can have a robust business model, you can have a resilient business model, you can have an adaptive business model, or you can have what's called anti-fragile. These are all very different types of model, and although I'm going to be describing them individually, it's important to know that it's very rare for one business to only have one model, right? It's probably going to be a mix of things, and there's going to be higher and lower prevalences of these 4 characteristics within any one business. Our business is mainly robust, but we do have a few adaptive parts. Our business is almost entirely anti-fragile, except for these parts which are resilient. So I'm going to be presenting it to keep it simple as sort of a one business model type, but in reality, businesses often are a mix of these. And you can think of these models as, again, in metaphor, how do they react to that wave coming at them from the Black Swan event? The Black Swan cannonballs into the pond. You've got your business structure from some distance away from that impact. The wave's coming at you. It will recede over time, but when it hits your structure, how that wave is processed and reacts is the basis of these business models. So the simplest one, and I think the traditional one, is a robust business model. You're building your business structure like a dam levee, right? It's big, it's thick, it's built with concrete, it sits there above the surface, and it's designed to absorb that wave and just bounce it back off. You've got depth, you've got resources, you've built robustness into it, and you have, your intent is to absorb the wave. Well, as we know, with most dams or levees, that works to a point in time, but if a strong enough wave comes at you, it's going to crack that robustness like an eggshell. It's just going to blow right through it. And you see this when large tsunamis. So the reason Black Swan events tend to be called Black Swans and just not another week in the office is they have so much strength. These little events that cause ripples are happening all the time, and most businesses that are robust are simply absorbing it and moving on. But a Black Swan, almost by definition, the wave is so powerful, it just blows through that robustness. And that's where a lot of businesses are struggling right now, is they've only had a robust model that has gotten blown away, or the depth's been exhausted, the resources have been exhausted, and they have nothing left. A resilient model is designed to ride out the wave. So again, if we use the metaphor of the pond, the resilient model might be a slimmer model where the water is just designed to go over it, or maybe it's even beneath the surface. It's not trying to stop that turbulence with force. It's simply trying to ride it out in a smooth and efficient way that prevents it from breaking. Now, this is very useful in certain kinds of black swans because and what does resilient mean in a business sense? It might be low cost structure. It might be a lot of pieces and parts that are redundant. So if one area goes down, we have backup somewhere else. There's a lot of effort that's been done in disaster recovery to build resilience. So yes, the wave's coming over, but it's going to pass over us and we're going to be okay. Again, though, a big enough black swan event can really challenge this because in this case now, the resilience we're talking about the multiple dimensions of turbulence. The resilience is often built for one kind of things, but now in a black swan event, you have these ripple effects cascading throughout the pond, and you got all this turbulence coming at you. It can break apart the resilience structure. And again, there's no one answer to this. These are just the pros and cons of each one. An adaptive business model is sort of like it changes or attempts to change to the sort of the velocity of the water. So again, this metaphor of a wave coming at you, an adaptive model might try and literally transform itself from one way of acting when the pond is calm to another way of acting when the wave's coming at it. And this can be powerful. The challenge is that you have to see the wave coming, and then you have to be fast enough adapting to put in place your adaptation before that wave hits. So you see this a lot in technology companies, that like mobile companies that try to say, well, we're just going to pivot to a new model because we're doing mobile devices or we're doing mobile apps and we can change what we're doing. Well, that's easier when everything you do is digital. If you're in a brick and mortar fixed location, or you got a group of workers that are doing a very certain skilled trade or work style, it's harder to do. Those fast adaptations are trickier, and the adaptive model then presumes that you both can see it coming far enough in advance and or have enough time to adapt. Otherwise, you tend to get blown away, just like the robust model. You're in the process of changing, or you didn't even see it coming when it hits you. And this leads to the last one, which is anti-fragile. And this one's a bit tricky to understand, but the anti-fragile business model doesn't try and defeat the volatility or the turbulence that comes from the Black Swan event. The anti-fragile model actually seeks that out and uses it to amplify its business. Now, this can be a little confusing, but all of these things, Black Swan and these definitions, come from a gentleman named Nassim Taleb, who defined them over a course of works in the early 2000s. But he defined anti-fragile as a relationship that a fragile business, which he would define as robust, resilient, and adaptive, when turbulence increased, their profit and responsiveness decreased. So, I mean, that makes sense, right? You're getting hit by these waves. You're focused on hunkering down with resilient or riding it out as robust or trying to adapt. You're not necessarily profiting off it. You're just trying to get through it. Those are what he would call fragile business models. Anti-fragile business models, as the volatility increases or the turbulence increases, they increase as well. They actually are being heightened by the presence of volatility in the system. And that's a very tricky concept to grasp until you think about things like, if you think about stock market and trades, there are some people who day trade, and the only way they make money is off high volatility in the market, right? If the market's steady and calm, the person who just buys and holds is going to do fine. But if there's a high volatility in the market, those day traders they don't care about the stock, they're just in and out trading, they tend to make a lot more profits when there's high volatility. That's a version of anti-fragile. And that exposes the challenge of anti-fragile business models, is that they're not as good in steady eddy, simple, calm ponds, right? If you are if you've developed an anti-fragile model and there's no volatility in your system, then you've built a lot of investment and resources in something you're not going to recoup or get back because you're not experiencing that turbulence. However, if you call it right and you're in either a pond that gets a lot of turbulence or a black swan hits, that anti-fragility model is going to allow you to accelerate up while everyone else is just trying to stay even or minimize how far they go down. You're actually accelerating up. So it can be a very powerful business model, but it's just tricky to predict when's the right time to use it. And for all of these types of business models, how do you know which one to pick? And again, I said I introduced them sort of one at a time, but the reality is different businesses will have mixes and blends of these types of elements of robustness, resilience, adaptive, and anti-fragile. The structured systems thinking is the way that we look at the system, we look at the pond you're in, we look at the nature of the events that are coming at you and the turbulence they can create, and that's how you design what the right business model is, right? If you are in a certain industry that works a certain way and all your competitors are robust, but you sense there's volatility coming at the thing, you may not want to go anti-fragile, but you may want to go resilient or adaptive, or you may want to increase resilience and adaptive. And you use the system structure to understand that system and understand what's the right play, what are the trade-offs. Again, all of these types of changes you make to your business model involve trade-offs. There's no one easy bullet that just says, we'll always be anti-fragile and that will be the best. It's always a matter of trade-offs, but understanding what the four kinds of business models are and how to blend them and what the impacts are probably informs the decision-making of how are we going to ride out future things like COVID-19, or how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen to us again? And of course, you can't just have a business that only reacts to the last black swan. There's an adage you'll hear, we're fighting the last war, right? That tends to happen in businesses too. There was a lot of fear of Y2K introduced the concept of the one-off disaster and disaster recovery. So a lot of businesses built resilience of extra locations, backup generators, things like that. They weren't really prepared for the financial collapse, which was a financial black swan. And then a lot in the last 8 years have been, okay, financial black swan, we're going to make sure our house is in order, our debts are aligned, we're not going to be too risky with our investment strategies. And now COVID hits. That's the nature of black swan events, is you cannot predict them in advance, and you cannot rely that the last black swan tells you what the next one's going to be. So picking these strategies, you got to be really cognizant of what your specific work environment is and what's going to help in that particular pond for when the black swan hits. So appreciate your time today. If you have any questions on structured systems thinking, have a problem you'd like our help on, or want to know more about developing your own capabilities in systems thinking, please reach out at the email below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in what we do and want to follow our journey, I've added our LinkedIn and Twitter information. And we plan to regularly update this channel with quick tips and case studies to help you get the most out of your systems thinking and lean efforts. If you want to be notified whenever we add new video content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below this video.